When you talk about the giants of gaming, Resident Evil is always in the conversation. It's been around for almost 3 decades now, starting all the way back in 1996 on the original PlayStation. And since then, it's basically been on every piece of hardware that could run a game. PS2, GameCube, PS5, Xbox Series X, you name it, Resident Evil has been there. And somehow, after all this time, the series is still hitting hard. The RE4 remake in 2023 reminded everyone why this franchise refuses to die. So today, we're doing what every Resident Evil fan secretly loves, ranking the mainline games from worst to best. No spin-offs, no revelations, no Outbreak, none of that. Just the core games. Because if we covered every single side title, we'd be here until the T-Virus wipes us out. And yeah, this list isn't gospel. Most of these games aren't bad, so personal taste plays a huge role. But that's half the fun. So grab your herbs, load the grenade launcher, and let's step back into the world of survival horror. The RE3 remake is a weird mix. Really fun to play, but not on the same level as the RE2 remake. Some of that comes from the original source material being more action-focused, but even then, RE2 just felt more complete. Still, RE3 is nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be. It's fast, explosive, and entertaining, just with some choices that don't always work. You play as Jill Valentine escaping Raccoon City while Umbrella's new bioweapon hunts her. This version of Jill feels grounded and believable, and Carlos is a big improvement too. The whole game leans heavily into cinematic action. Explosions, collapsing streets, frantic escapes, and barely slows down. It's still survival horror with limited ammo and inventory stress, but it's more aggressive and linear than RE2. There's some light exploration, but never the hub feeling of the police station or mansion. Combat is faster thanks to the dodge mechanic, and environmental hazards encourage offense. Zombies have slightly less gore detail than RE2, but they're still the best in the genre. Nemesis is a mixed bag. The few unscripted encounters feel awkward, but the big scripted chases and cinematic moments are incredible and easily the highlight. There are small pockets of classic survival horror tension, and a few puzzles, but they're brief. The biggest issue is cut or rearranged content. Major locations like the clock tower interior are gone, and some fan-favorite moments didn't make it. Some changes work well, but others feel like missed chances. Choices from the original are removed, and there's only one ending. The final act is a huge improvement, though, bigger and more exciting. The main downside is length. Most players finish in under 5 hours. The game is fun to replay on harder difficulties, but it's not as replayable as RE2. After finishing, you unlock a shop to buy bonus items and classic weapons, which helps a bit. The remake originally came with Resident Evil Resistance, an asymmetrical multiplayer mode that's surprisingly decent, even if not long-lasting. Overall, the RE3 remake cuts some important content and ends quickly, but it's still a blast. Visually impressive, full of huge moments, and absolutely worth playing with the right expectations. Resident Evil 0 is a prequel to the remake of Resident Evil 1, focusing on what happened to the Star's Bravo team before the mansion incident. The story follows Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, a fugitive soldier accused of mass murder. Rebecca boards a train full of T-Virus infected passengers and meets Billy. And with most of Bravo already dead, the two are forced to work together to survive. The game moves from the train to areas like the training facility, laboratory, factory, and treatment plant. Zero improves on remake visually with strong pre-rendered backgrounds, subtle camera pans, and more CG cutscenes, including variations depending on which character you're controlling. The soundtrack is also more dramatic and memorable than Remake's atmospheric score. The remaster's control layout causes issues, especially if you're used to Remake's mapping. None of the presets match Remake's setup, and actions like opening the inventory or running are assigned to different face buttons, while making early gameplay feel awkward without manual remapping. The main mechanic is dual character control. Instead of switching only at scripted moments, you actively alternate between Rebecca and Billy at any time. Move them together or separately and manage their distinct strengths. Billy is tougher and moves heavy objects, while Rebecca mixes herbs but is much more fragile. The partner AI is reliable, and the system has potential for thoughtful planning on repeat playthroughs. However, Zero complicates resource management. Item boxes are removed entirely, requiring you to drop items on the ground and remember where you left them. With each character limited to 6 item slots, and some weapons now taking 2 slots, inventory quickly becomes cramped. Backtracking for weapons, ammo, or key items becomes common and often unnecessary. The game also has a habit of surprising the player with sudden boss fights or mandatory encounters without warning, which can be punishing if the character you're controlling is low on health or missing essential items. This happens throughout the campaign, leading to frequent frustration rather than fair challenge. Story-wise, Zero expands Resident Evil lore by covering the downfall of Bravo Team, showing Wesker and Birkin's early cooperation, and introducing Dr. Marcus, creator of the progenitor virus and the game's main antagonist. It ties into Resident Evil 2 through familiar locations like the marshalling yard, though these nods are mostly surface-level connections. Voice acting is weaker than in Remake, with stiffer delivery and inconsistent casting for recurring characters. Despite this, the final level is handled well, with sensible item placement, clear objectives, and a multi-stage final boss that uses both characters. Overall, Resident Evil 0 has strong visuals, interesting ideas, and the foundation of classic Resident Evil exploration. However, overcomplicated inventory systems, lack of item boxes, unpredictable difficulty spikes, and frequent forced backtracking make the experience more frustrating than enjoyable for many players. Resident Evil 6 is a third-person action shooter, featuring 4 separate campaigns that follow Leon S. Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Ada Wong, and Jake. Each campaign offers a different style of gameplay, and the entire game can be played solo or in co-op. Additional modes like Mercenaries, Survivors, and Onslaught add more content beyond the main story. Gameplay focuses heavily on fast-paced action. You'll spend most of your time running, shooting, and fighting through large groups of infected enemies. Ammo is plentiful, and certain characters can use melee attacks that feel more like kung fu than traditional survival horror. Boss encounters are large and chaotic, and playing co-op generally makes the experience more enjoyable. The quick access inventory system keeps the pace moving, and if you're downed in combat, your partner can revive you. Each of the 4 campaigns has its own identity. Chris's scenarios put you in a special ops unit fighting infected forces in the streets of China. Jake's campaign pushes even further into over-the-top action, while Ada and Leon's stories offer more balance. The variety is impressive, but the overall experience often ends up feeling disconnected from what Resident Evil traditionally represents. The game leans so heavily into action that it frequently feels shallow and forgettable, especially for longtime fans expecting tension or horror. Visually, the game looks strong, with detailed environments, varied locations, and cinematic set pieces that stand out as some of the best-looking moments in the series. The voice acting, sound effects, and music are competent, though not particularly memorable. Resident Evil 6 delivers a large amount of content, plenty of high-energy moments, and a co-op system that works well. However, its focus on non-stop action makes it feel more like an arcade shooter than a survival horror game. The story leans into exaggerated spectacle, and despite its size and ambition, much of it comes across as unfocused and lacking the atmosphere that defines the franchise. Overall, it's an enjoyable action game, but it strays far from the core identity of Resident Evil. Players looking for a traditional survival horror experience won't find it here, but those wanting a flashy, fast-paced shooter may enjoy what it offers. Resident Evil Village is a direct sequel to Resident Evil 7, continuing the first-person survival horror approach, but with bigger action and stranger, more exaggerated horror elements. The game begins shortly after the events of 7. Ethan Winters is living quietly with his wife and newborn daughter until Chris Redfield appears, disrupts everything, and sets a new story in motion. Ethan then finds himself in a remote, eerie village deep in what resembles the Romanian wilderness. The structure is similar to Resident Evil 7 in that the game moves through several themed zones, each centered around different characters and horror styles. Much like how each member of the Baker family had distinct areas and tones, Village presents multiple sections inspired by different horror concepts, with each major antagonist ruling over their own region. The village itself serves as the central hub. After each major event or boss encounter, the player returns to the village and uses newly acquired items to open up more areas, access secrets, and find additional resources. Although the main progression paths are fairly direct, exploration is heavily encouraged and is where much of the game's design shines. Combat is more active than in 7. Ethan is better trained and far more capable, with more weapons, more ammo, and more frequent encounters. The moment-to-moment gameplay revolves around shooting, crafting, and managing resources. The enemies are limited in variety and some become repetitive, but the gunplay feels impactful with satisfying weapon feedback and powerful enemy reactions to headshots and shotgun blasts. Resource management still matters, but the game provides more breathing room than its predecessor. Difficulty varies. Standard mode is relatively easy, especially for series veterans, while higher difficulties offer a more balanced challenge. The game mixes large-scale action segments with several sections that focus solely on horror without combat, some of which are extremely intense. Village also brings back a merchant system reminiscent of Resident Evil 4. The Duke sells items, upgrades weapons, and provides new attachments. Players earn currency from enemies and exploration, and the upgrade loop is both meaningful and rewarding. Hunting small animals for ingredients allows the Duke to cook meals that permanently improve Ethan's stats, adding another layer to exploration. Puzzles are minimal, mostly revolving around finding items and placing them in the correct spots, rather than complex problem-solving. The game instead emphasizes exploration in hidden areas, many of which contain valuable weapons or upgrades. The game excels visually. Environments are detailed and atmospheric with impressive vistas and striking location design. Sound design contributes to tension during quiet moments, and the presentation remains strong across both PS5 and PS4 Pro versions. On PC, the lack of an FOV slider may bother some players. Playtime is similar to most Resident Evil titles. The first run typically lasts around 8 to 11 hours depending on playstyle. Like previous entries, the game encourages replayability with unlockable weapons, challenges, and a post-game shop. Mercenaries mode returns as an extra arcade-style challenge mode, though it is more simplified compared to past versions. Narratively, Village delivers a compelling standalone story within the new Resident Evil continuity, established by 7 with several memorable moments and surprising shifts. However, its connection to the larger series lore is limited, and some story elements may feel underdeveloped in relation to the broader franchise. Overall, Resident Evil Village offers a mix of horror, action, exploration, and replayability. It may not match every strength of Resident Evil 7, but it delivers a creative, varied, and engaging experience that appeals to both new players and longtime fans. Resident Evil Code Veronica follows Claire Redfield as she infiltrates an Umbrella facility in search of her brother, Chris. After being captured in Paris during the raid, she is transported to Rockfort Island, a remote prison complex run by Umbrella in the Southern Ocean. Shortly after her arrival, a T-virus outbreak devastates the island, allowing Claire to escape amid the chaos. The game takes place 3 months after the events of Resident Evil 2. Code Veronica was originally released on the Sega Dreamcast and later expanded as Resident Evil Code Veronica X for PlayStation 2, which added new scenes and story elements. Although intended as the true sequel to Resident Evil 2, business decisions led to Resident Evil 3 receiving the numbered title instead. Despite strong sales and an important place in the series' narrative, Code Veronica has remained one of the few major entries not yet remade. As the first Resident Evil game to move from pre-rendered backgrounds to fully real-time 3D environments, Code Veronica created a different atmosphere from earlier entries. Environments adopt a gothic, European-inspired aesthetic despite the Antarctic setting, especially within the Ashford family's grand residence. Tank controls remain, but the dynamic camera pans and zooms enhance immersion, making exploration feel more fluid than previous titles. Visually, it was the most advanced Resident Evil game at its release, with notable in-game cutscene quality. The story leans heavily into operatic, gothic melodrama. The Ashford family, the ruling power behind the island, drives much of the narrative. Alfred Ashford in particular stands out for his unstable split personality, alternating between himself and his twin sister, Alexia, who has been cryogenically frozen for 17 years. His exaggerated mannerisms and unraveling psyche make him one of the more memorable antagonists in the series. Another major presence is Albert Wesker, returning as a superhuman rogue agent seeking the T. Veronica virus. His appearances are dramatic, underscoring his evolution into one of the series' most relentless villains. Wesker's dynamic with Chris Redfield comes into focus when Chris reaches Rockfort Island later in the game, retracing Claire's path through the prison complex, training facilities, and Ashford Estate before traveling to the Antarctic research base. The expanded version, Code Veronica X, adds more scenes featuring Wesker, and includes an extended confrontation between him and Chris following the final battle with Alexia. These additions help flesh out Wesker's growing influence on the overarching narrative. Not every element is as strong. Steve Burnside, the new supporting character who teams up with Claire, is widely regarded as one of the weaker companions in the series. His personality and voice acting often clash with the tone of the story, and his role feels more obligatory than compelling. The puzzles, while traditional to Resident Evil, are some of the most obscure in the franchise. Many require trial-and-error solutions or external guides, and several irreversible checkpoints can lead to significant replaying if the player advances without adequate resources. This difficulty curve and the rigid save system reflect older design conventions that would likely be reworked in a modern remake. Despite these flaws, Resident Evil Code Veronica is one of the purest continuations of the classic Resident Evil formula. Its challenging gameplay, grand environments, dramatic characters, and important narrative developments give it a unique identity within the series, even if it has often been overlooked compared to the numbered entries. Resident Evil 3. Nemesis follows Jill Valentine as she attempts to escape Raccoon City during the T-virus outbreak. The game drops her directly into the chaos with no build-up, immediately establishing a faster, more action-oriented tone than the previous entries. One of its key systems is the gunpowder mixing mechanic, which allows players to craft different ammunition types and improve their efficiency through repeated mixing. This adds replay value and lets players shape their loadouts around preferred weapons. Overall, the game provides more ammo than earlier titles, but resource management still matters. Nemesis is the central threat, appearing unpredictably throughout the game. Players can either run or fight him, and defeating him rewards useful upgrades like enhanced handgun parts or expanded healing storage. His encounters are intense, though the early fights can be overwhelming with Jill's limited gear. The dodge mechanic returns but is inconsistent, especially near walls or when it triggers unintentionally during firing. Early on, Jill briefly revisits the Raccoon Police Department, retrieving supplies from the STR's office before continuing through the city. New enemy types, such as the Drain Deimos, complicate encounters with their speed and irregular movement. Carlos and Nikolai of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service play supporting roles throughout the story. The Clock Tower segment offers a short return to more traditional Resident Evil design, with tighter layouts and light puzzles. After a boss fight that leaves Jill infected, players temporarily control Carlos through the hospital, facing hunters and securing the vaccine that saves her. The final stretch includes the park, cemetery, disposal plant, and the missile strike countdown. Choices made in earlier live selection prompts can slightly alter events and character outcomes. The last battles with Nemesis include both a mutated form and the use of the experimental railgun. Resident Evil 3 is more linear and combat-focused than its predecessors, trading the dense, interconnected structure of Resident Evil 1 and 2 for faster pacing and constant pressure. Despite being less intricate, it remains memorable thanks to Jill's focused storyline, the tension created by Nemesis, and solid action-driven gameplay. Resident Evil 5 is often ranked low in series lists, mostly because it had the curse of releasing right after the legendary Resident Evil 4 and leaned heavily into action. That reputation is a bit unfair. It's different, sure, but underneath the co-op focus and big dumb set pieces, it's still a very solid third-person survival horror shooter, just with less horror and more punching. Released in 2009 on PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, the game moves the series to West Africa. Chris Redfield is sent to stop arms dealer Ricardo Irving, who's selling bioweapons on the black market. Things quickly spiral into a full-scale outbreak involving the progenitor virus, the roots of the T-virus, and the return of Albert Wesker at his most cartoonishly awesome. Leather coat, sunglasses, matrix energy, and final showdown in a volcano. Along the way, you also get Excellagione, a vain, rich villain, and a very obvious mystery plague doctor, whose true identity won't surprise anyone. The big shift is co-op. Chris is partnered with Shiva Alamar, who's with you the entire game. Most encounters, puzzles, and level layouts are built around two characters, kicking doors together, covering each other from different angles, splitting paths, and reviving one another. In co-op, this is where the game shines. In single-player, Shiva's AI is generally useful with a rifle or SMG, but she heals a bit too aggressively, makes stealth impossible against certain enemies, and can turn higher difficulties into a headache. Despite that, she's one of the most underrated characters in the series and has never really been used again, which is a shame. Gameplay builds directly on RE4. Over-the-shoulder aiming, tank controls, context melee, stuns from limb shots, explosive barrels, and enemies that sprout Las Plagas-style mutations. Enemies here are the Machini, infected villagers who later gain chainsaws, miniguns, and nasty transformations. Gunplay feels weighty and satisfying. Pistols can pop heads, shotguns clear crowds, rifles reward precision, and magnums and rocket launchers delete big threats. Weapon choice is more about preference than a single best option. Different pistols, shotguns, and rifles trade raw damage for capacity or fire rate, and a quick swap inventory replaces the old pause-to-switch system, keeping the pace fast. Tonally, Resident Evil 5 is the least survival horror the series had been up to that point. There's very little puzzling, almost no classic slower exploration, and a lot of set pieces. Turret sections, vehicle chases, daytime combat arenas, and scripted encounters. It sometimes tries to be a cover shooter without really having modern movement or cover systems, which leads to a few clunky sections. But as a big, over-the-top action horror game, it mostly works. Especially if you embrace the spectacle instead of expecting a mansion-style slow burn. The art style and harsh, dusty filter help make the setting feel hot, hostile, and alien, and many environments still look good today. Bosses are a mixed bag. Some rely too much on weak spot repetition or environmental gimmicks, and fights like Wesker and Jill can be more annoying than fun on a first run. On repeat playthroughs, though, once you've upgraded your gear and unlocked infinite ammo, they become much more enjoyable. Where RE5 really earns its keep is replay value and extra content. New Game Plus, weapon upgrades, infinite ammo unlocks, and the Mercenaries mode give you a lot to do after finishing the story. Mercenaries in particular is addictive. Scoring runs, unlocking new characters, like Wesker, alternate Chris and Shiva, Jill, Barry, Rebecca, and even Excella, and experimenting with broken loadouts keeps the game alive long after the credits roll. Resident Evil 5 isn't as groundbreaking as RE4, and it's far from pure survival horror. But it's not the disaster some make it out to be. Taken on its own terms, as an action-heavy, co-op-driven Resident Evil with great gunplay, memorable villains, and tons of replay value, it's one of the most underappreciated entries in the series. Resident Evil 2 is one of those rare sequels that not only holds up decades later, but in many ways improves on the original while still respecting it. Instead of a single mansion, the game moves the action to Raccoon City, the streets, the police station, and a few other key locations. It feels more open than the first game, but the progression is still tightly designed. The excellent map, clearer objectives, and smarter layout make navigating and backtracking more logical and less confusing, without losing the tension or survival feel. Core survival mechanics remain. Limited ammo, careful resource management, ink ribbons for saving, and shared item boxes all return. The game keeps tank controls and fixed camera angles, but for 1998 it handles them very well, with thoughtful camera placement that keeps disorientation to a minimum. Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield are new protagonists, and by the end they feel just as established as Jill and Chris from the first game. The supporting cast is stronger overall too, with characters like Ada Wong and Sherry Birkin adding variety and emotional weight to the story, while tying neatly into the wider Umbrella and Raccoon City lore. Visually, Resident Evil 2 improves on the original with more detailed character models and high-quality pre-rendered backgrounds. Versions like the Dreamcast release push this even further with sharper visuals and extra modes. As a sequel, Resident Evil 2 keeps what worked, refines what didn't, and expands the world in a way that feels natural. Even if it's not your personal favorite in the series, it's still an exceptionally well-crafted survival horror game that defines why this era of Resident Evil is so beloved. This is how you remake a classic. Instead of just updating graphics and controls, Capcom rebuilt Resident Evil 2 from the ground up, capturing the atmosphere, dread, and tension that made the 1998 game iconic. It's not a massive game, but almost every minute feels sharp, gory, and memorable. After 20 years, I'd forgotten most of the original, so this remake felt fresh. Yet the improvement is obvious when you compare them. The lighting, facial animations, and unbelievably gruesome zombies are stunning, easily some of the best undead ever put in a game. The story has a few rearranged moments and surprises, but it stays faithful to the dark tone of the original. Leon and Claire are still simple, pure-hearted protagonists, while the side characters steal more of the spotlight. Gameplay holds strong. Tense exploration, fun puzzles, and slow, deliberate combat. Raccoon City is split into 3 major areas that gradually open up as you learn their layout, and resource management is still the core of the experience. You're always low on ammo, always low on healing, and always one mistake away from death. Excellent sound design amplifies that fear at every turn. The remake is kinder than the original, with quality of life updates like free saving and helpful maps that track items for you. But the real terror early on is the Tyrant, an unstoppable, emotionless stalker whose heavy footsteps build pure dread. Later, though, he stops being scary and becomes more of a constant annoyance during puzzle-heavy sections. Leon's campaign took me 8 fast hours, and I jumped into Claire's expecting a very different viewpoint. Instead, both characters follow nearly identical routes, fight the same bosses, and solve the same puzzles, just with different weapons and one unique side character each. The true alternate perspective is strangely hidden behind each character's second-run mode, something most players won't realize until they've repeated the same content twice. Still, Capcom nailed what matters: atmosphere, tension, exploration, and combat. This remake not only honors the original, it sets a new standard for how classic games should be rebuilt. After the great remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, it seemed obvious Capcom would nail a Resident Evil 4 remake. But I still wasn't prepared for how hard this 2023 version hits. From the moment you start, it's a relentless 16-hour rush of tension, sharper pacing, and fully modernized combat that makes the original feel ancient by comparison. The 2005 game was revolutionary, but returning to it now shows how badly its stiff movement and stand still to shoot controls needed an update. This remake fixes everything. Leon can aim and move, dodge attacks, parry with his knife, and sneak around using a new crouch, all while keeping the combat just as intense thanks to limited ammo and unpredictable enemy behavior. Knives break, enemies swarm, and one mistake still gets Leon decapitated just like old times. Every environment is rebuilt to look darker, denser, and far more sinister. The Spanish village, castle, and island all feel more cohesive, with added side paths, puzzles, and even a fully explorable lake area. Audio design is incredible too. Villagers chanting, chainsaws revving in the distance, and monsters shrieking constantly keep the tension high. Iconic moments return, but smarter. Krauser's old QTE knife fight is now a real parry-based duel. Ashley no longer has a health bar, making escort sections far less frustrating. The merchant offers new crafting recipes, side quests, and upgrades, though he's missing a bit of the goofy charm his original voice had. The campaign also fixes the original's messy final act, delivering a stronger and more satisfying finale. The boss fights are rebuilt, the pacing is tighter, and the whole game feels designed with modern expectations in mind without losing the weird, chaotic spirit of RE4. Aside from a slightly less charming merchant, Capcom barely missteps. This remake is smoother, scarier, more dynamic, and overflowing with smart improvements, big and small. If you're new to RE4 or returning after decades, this remake is a no-brainer. It's the most intense, exciting Resident Evil experience Capcom has ever delivered. Resident Evil 4 is a masterpiece. Some people push back on that, saying loving RE4 but disliking action-heavy entries like RE6 makes you not a real fan. But replaying RE4 today only proves the opposite. It's still one of the tightest, smartest, most exhilarating action horror games ever made. RE4 wasn't the first step toward action in the series, but it was the first full leap. And it nailed the transition. The controls sound limiting on paper, no moving while shooting, tank-style movement. Yet the entire game is designed around those limitations. Enemies pause, telegraph attacks, spread out, and give you space to react. Every fight becomes a dance of spacing, timing, and smart target choices. Combine that with incredible hit feedback, loud audio cues, and enemies that respond in instantly readable ways, and the game still feels amazing. Are there flaws? Sure. Some rooms, like the water room, are badly designed. Novista doors are miserable. The inventory system is dated. And yes, the knife-mashing QTEs aren't great. But none of these issues break the experience because the core design is so strong. Ashley also gets a bad reputation she doesn't deserve. She's with you for only a fraction of the game. She sticks right behind Leon. She ducks out of the way. She hides when you tell her to, and she rarely gets into trouble unless you make a mistake. She's one of the least frustrating escort characters ever. Pacing is another reason RE4 works where later, action entries fail. The game mixes slow tension, open combat arenas, goofy villains, and over-the-top set pieces, but spaces them perfectly. It never goes full chaos the way RE6 does, and it never loses its sense of silliness. Leon's one-liners, the cartoon villain bosses, and the sheer absurdity of the situations keep the tone light enough that contrived moments feel intentional rather than lazy. The campaign is already fantastic, but the extra content elevates it even further. Mercenaries, separate ways, and the ridiculous bonus weapons, especially the Chicago typewriter, turn replaying into its own reward. Some people blame RE4 for the direction the series took afterward, but that's not on the game. It's on Capcom chasing the wrong lessons. You don't blame Die Hard for its bad sequels. RE4 was great then, and it's great now. Despite a few outdated systems, it remains one of the most brilliantly crafted action horror games ever made. Every time I revisit it, I end up wanting to start another playthrough immediately. And that's the surest sign of a timeless classic. Remakes usually get a bad reaction, and honestly, it's often deserved. A lot of them feel like lazy cash grabs that miss what made the original special. But every now and then you get a remake that actually understands the source material and somehow goes beyond it. Resident Evil 2002 is one of those rare cases. It doesn't just update the 1996 classic, it outclasses it in almost every meaningful way. The original RE's intro and tone are iconic, but mostly because they're so cheesy. Live-action actors, stiff line reads, "You were almost a Jill sandwich." It's horror but wrapped in B-movie silliness. It works now as a kind of campy classic, but it's not exactly scary. The remake takes that same setup and plays it dead serious. Tighter editing, better framing, actual tension as Joseph is attacked, Jill panics, and the team scrambles into the mansion. It immediately feels like a proper horror story instead of an awkward FMV experiment. That shift carries into the whole game. The PS1 mansion feels like a weird, bright house that just happens to have zombies. The remake's mansion feels cursed. Deep shadows, stormlight flashing through windows, unsettling camera angles that hide what's around the corner. Even after multiple playthroughs, it still has moments that make you tense up. The voice acting moves from so bad it's funny to good enough not to break immersion, which fits the more serious mood. What really makes the remake shine, though, is how it messes with players who think they know the original. Rooms are rearranged. New areas like the cemetery and Lisa Trevor's cabin are added, and familiar moments are twisted. The hallway where dogs famously crash through the windows? Now they don't. At least not when you expect it. Zombies you left on the floor in earlier REs were just dead. Here, if you don't burn or decapitate them, they can come back later as Crimson Heads. Faster, more aggressive, and absolutely terrifying the first time one sprints up off the floor. Suddenly, your problem-solved bodies are a time bomb, and managing corpses becomes part of the strategy. Lisa Trevor is the perfect example of what the remake adds. A tragic, grotesque new enemy that's built up through files and distant sounds before you ever see her. And when you finally do, the game doesn't milk it with a cutscene. She just appears in your path, and it's genuinely unnerving. Same with little touches like zombies breaking through doors you always assumed were safe transitions. The game constantly pokes at things you thought were rules. The original Resident Evil still has value, it's important historically, and its janky charm is fun in its own right. But as an actual horror experience, the 2002 remake is on another level. If you only have time to play one version of the Spencer Mansion, it should be the remake every single time.